Greetings and welcome back to the Octopus Movement podcast, where we highlight nonlinear thinkers from around the world and discuss their connection to the octopus movement and their efforts to solve the world's seemingly unsolvable problems. I am your host, Grant Harris, a fellow nonlinear thinker, consultant, author, and board member. And today I am very excited for our particular guest. Her background is extensive. She does a lot of things that we hopefully can dive into in 30 minutes. But I have the pleasure of interviewing Jennifer Hill. Jennifer, welcome. I appreciate you being here on short notice. Very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with all the viewers, and all the other nonlinear thinkers out there around the world. Welcome to the Octopus Movement.
Yeah. So Jennifer, when I say that you do a lot, you have lots of labels, lots of jobs, lots of things that you do: entrepreneur, TV host, moderator, trainer, coach, author, et cetera, and the list goes on. Um, I would love it if you would take us through your origin story, um, who you are, how your thinking shows up in the world, uh, anything that you would like to highlight about your background in particular. But before we do that, I do want to give condolences. I hear that your father recently passed away, and if you would care to share anything about your relationship with him, that's great. That's up to you. Or if you'd like to keep it private, but I did want to give condolences for the passing of your father. But if you don't mind, if you could just share your origin story, the audience would love to hear.
Thank you so much, Grant. And yes, my father did pass away a week ago, Sunday, so on February 25th. He left this world, and I am so grateful that my dad and I, had this incredible relationship the last 3 or 4 years of my life. Since 2020, actually, we were talking every day on the phone. I would call my mom, call my dad, and life was not always that way. In fact, in 2017, my mom and dad and I went with my ex-husband and built our first school together in Nepal. And then we had the honor of my dad and I, just the two of us, got to fly to Senegal in late 2019 and build a school together there. And it was unbelievable. My dad was a very, very generous, giving man, and it definitely shaped our reality. Sometimes, it was funny when I got diagnosed as being high functioning on the spectrum, which was much, much later in life, about 6, 7 years ago. I remember learning it was genetic. And I remember going, And I'm like, no, not my mom. And I'm like, my dad. Oh, yeah. It's like, so I'd had some interesting conversations in the last several years of my dad's life, just being very transparent and saying, Dad, had you ever considered that you might be on the spectrum? And, he was so sweet and regimented, like you'd eat the same food every day and do the same thing and never deviate. And so it was really kind of cool, though, that he and I grew closer in the last several years, because when I was very young, I didn't get along well with my parents. I didn't get along well with anybody, and particularly not with myself. I saw the world differently. The only way I could explain it to people, Grant, from an origin story standpoint, it's like you got a book on how to be normal and you got a book on how to be normal. And I was failing the class on how to be normal. Like I was getting straight Fs because my brain just didn't process the world the same way. I couldn't understand, well, like a whole class would take an hour to learn a topic. And in the first 5 minutes, I'd learned the whole topic. And by the time I was 16, I begged my parents to please leave high school and go straight to college, which I did. And at that time, though, I had built my identity around being the good girl. Like I could follow rules to a T. Like if you gave me a rule, I could follow it. Okay, get straight A's and you'll be successful and you'll have your parents laugh. Okay, well, I tried that on. Unfortunately, that logic puzzle in my brain didn't fit, because by the time I was 16, my sister had some needs that she had that needed to be dealt with. And so I felt kind of ignored, and I wasn't able to get any sort of recognition for all of the accomplishments. And I thought, well, in my deluded brain at that time, I thought, well, if I'm getting straight A's and being the good girl and that's not working, well, maybe I'll go to the other side and break every single rule that's ever existed. And that led to about 7 to 8 years of just deep self-loathing, depression, suicidal ideation. I tried to kill myself 3 times, twice almost successfully. In fact, my mom and I just drove by the place that somebody found me wandering after having taken a box of Somanex sleeping pills, and somehow or another I survived it. We drove by the place where my car was hanging upside down over a cliff when I was 17 years old. And the fact that I'm still here, honestly, Grant, is mind-blowing, given I would not be here if it hadn't been by sheer force and miracles. And now I'm grateful to understand that everything that I thought was a detriment to me when I was younger, of not fitting in, not understanding myself or others, is actually what led me to build our new company. Is I had to study human beings as though they were a logic puzzle to better understand. Like, one day I might write a book called The Logic Puzzle Life, because I love logic puzzles. Like, if you give me, like, Lumosity has a game, if grapes can't be next to peas but need to be left of berries but to the right of banana, where does carrot go? And my brain is like, yes, that is awesome. Like, I love things where I have to, like, put pieces together in ways that other people maybe can't. And that's actually what led us to building my current company, is just studying people and really arduously trying to understand what makes us tick as human beings. So what once was my greatest detriment has become my greatest superpower.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Number one, several things. We have lots of things in common. Your dad and I had things in common. I eat very regimented. As a kid, it was like PB&J, like every day. And then, like in high school and college, it was like hot dogs, like every day. So I eat on a schedule. It baffles my mind when people say, "Oh, I forgot to eat." And I'm like, "How did you forget to eat?"
Every
Because
3 hours.
it's on the schedule. Yeah, it's
There's
on
a
the schedule. So I understand. Also diagnosed late in life, high functioning. So we have those things in common. I see in your background that you studied psychology, studied people. Uh, so let's dive into that a little bit more, because I'm a psychologist by trade and at heart. When you're studying people and you're looking at the logic puzzle, how does your nonlinear thinking come into play? And when you're studying people, how do you move them around? You talked about building schools, building companies. How does that work in your brain and take it from your brain to out in the world?
Hmm. So there have been 2 sides. It's like this dichotomy, Grant. So first I have to digress and say, yes, I am that person who eats the same food every day until I develop an allergy. I literally have food allergies to vanilla, peanuts. Like, I will eat the same day until I start, like, breaking out in hives from the food. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I should stop eating peanuts, since I've had that every day for 3 years straight. So that's just funny side story on that. But going into how my brain does that, I have these 2 dichotomy sides of my brain. I have the one side of my brain that is completely, utterly logical and loves to understand rules and formulaic. And like you said, eating, I literally follow a 2-hour routine every morning. I wake up, I journal, I write up what I'm grateful for, I pray, I meditate, I do inner child work, heart focused breathing, pray. And, like, I have, like, a very systematic side. And then on the other side, I am a complete anomaly where I trust 1000% in my intuition. And then I find ways to validate it scientifically in the world. So, for example, like, I'll be clearly given messages about things intuitively. Like, even people ask, how did you wind up living in Europe during COVID? And it was one day I was, sitting in Paris or in London, and I wound up getting a message that said, move to Paris. And this was all intuitively. So I have this left side logic brain, and then kind of this whimsical right side of my brain that comes up with stuff that I don't know where it comes from. And it'll say, move to Paris. And I'm like, well, I can't move to Paris. I'm a US citizen, and it's US citizens are not legally allowed in Paris. And through following my logical brain process of, well, if I were going to move to Paris, how would I move there? Okay, I'd need to get my dog there. Okay, can you fly a dog? Can you take the train? Turned out you couldn't fly and you couldn't take a train to get the dog to Paris if I was going to move there. This was so random, Grant. The only way that I could have gotten my dog into Paris during any time of the year, COVID or not, was via the English Channel. And it turned out that was the only legal way that you could go into Europe during COVID. So like, what are the odds? So that's kind of the weird melody of how my brain works. My brain starts with a logical problem it needs to solve. Then some obscure message or something comes to me intuitively, and then I find a way to marry the two. Does that make sense?
It does. I explain it similarly but differently. I have these dots out in the stratosphere and the atmosphere, and they're seemingly completely different apples, oranges. But then I see them, and then I find a way to like connect them. They're both fruit. They both have a color, and then I dig deeper to like, oh, now I see how this could like potentially work. And people are like, oh, I didn't see that before, and I'm like, well, I saw it out there, so I thought maybe it'll work. So yeah, similar thing, similar thing.
You're not.
I have not come across,
What
yeah, I
was
haven't come across the issue of trying to get a dog across the English Channel, but that's an interesting one. Um, so I would love to hear more about your businesses. You mentioned that you just launched one, but you have a little bit of serial entrepreneur in you from what I see. So tell us about your businesses, your babies, outside of your dog, and what they're doing and how you do it, how people can be involved. Tell us about your business.
Well, I have to say, Grant, I swear this was not a plant. Grant literally knows nothing about my business. I cannot believe you just used the apple orange analogy. That is the whole premise around our current company, OptiMatch. No joke. We even have 4 types, psychological types of
See?
motivating factors based on fruits. And I just got off a call with a potential client earlier. And she's like, well, why did you choose fruits? And it was for the exact reason you just said, Grant. I said, well, you know how it's like one person speaking apple and another speaking orange, and they literally cannot communicate, even if they both spoke English, because they're speaking different languages. That's what we learned to do with our current company, OptiMatch, is we have 4 fruit types: mango, lychee, pear, and apple. And we help them to understand how they communicate differently and then to match people based on motivating types. So that's what I'm doing currently. We have an amazing medical advisory team. One of our board members is out of Colombia, Dr. Marta Cedar. He's been extraordinary helping us with this. And so we're doing that now. Now, where we gained that knowledge from is I had sold my last company. It was just the 6-year anniversary of the sale of our company on February 28th of this year. And we had exited that company, which was a legal recruiting company. So I've always been fascinated, much like you are probably, Grant, from the psychological standpoint. When I was in recruiting, because again, I wasn't as adept as, say, a neurotypical person was, or normal, the way somebody who is more linear or typical would think about it, I found myself analyzing to way more of an extent than any other recruiter I'd ever come across. Why is this person taking that job? Why is this person not taking that job? Why do these 2 people get along? Why do these 2 people not get along? So after studying that for 15 years, that then came along, and God bless my current co-founder, Jules, who I just hung up with. He's also neurodiverse and on the spectrum. And God bless Jules, one day he said, Jen, let's create a software that mimics your intuition for matching people based on motivating factors. And I was like, can we even do that? So thank God, with my intuitive side and his software and logical side, he was able to create a mathematical formula to mirror what we did. So I feel like my whole life has come to this point of helping people understand, how do we crack the code of human connection? And what if it's all about aligning our motivators, and where there's misalignments, like you were talking about with the apple and the orange, how do we create greater alignment and enhance coherence in all our relationships? So that's my vision, our dream of what I'd love to do by the time I die, Grant, is to reverse the accidental adversarial relationship between human beings while enhancing relationships between 2 people.
Hmm. Interesting. When you had the fruit concept and the conversation, I'm a movie buff, and I don't know if you've seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, but it's awesome. And the dad, he talks about fruit, and that fruit came from the Greeks. It's funny. Yeah, you should check it out if you're not familiar. But I'm glad to hear that you're on a similar path with the fruit. Thank you for describing your ultimate vision, because that kind of gets to the heart of solving the unsolvable, or solving the impossible. And I'd love to hear more about your introduction to the Octopus Movement. What about the movement drew you to it? Perry's great. He's awesome. Was it just Perry, or was there someone else, or what was your involvement with the movement, and where would you like to see it go as a founding member? Where would you like? What's your vision for where it go?
Yeah, it's a thank you to Perry for having me on here. Thank you to all of our fellow founding members and members of the Octopus Movement around the world. I have to say, this is going to sound cliche. It was destiny, honestly, Grant, because about a year ago, it was actually last June, I do a lot of speaking around the world, and I had written this new talk called Cracking the Code of Human Connection, Lessons I Learned with Asperger's. And so I was on this private island with about 200 other, founders and entrepreneurs around the world, and 30 or so people came to my session. And no joke, Grant, out of me sharing honestly and candidly about my journey with autism and discovering it so much later in life, 5 people in that class all realized they were on the spectrum, and later actually came to me and are like, oh my God, it changed my life since I last saw you. I got the official diagnosis. I reconnected with my husband, lost weight. My whole life has transformed. So around this time last June, I started realizing that I wasn't, for women, it's much less common for women, number one, to get diagnosed as being on the spectrum to begin with. And number two, we get diagnosed much, much later in life because we learn better masking and coping skills. So it's not as often diagnosed in women. There's a great book called I Am Aspian Woman. So if somehow or another in the middle of all this, I started sharing, and I'd be out to breakfast or coffee or somewhere with somebody, and they'd start sharing with me about their child, their mother, their brother, that they themselves thought they might be on the spectrum. And so I started being very outspoken and just sharing my journey in hopes that it might help other people, help other parents. And through this journey, I got introduced to many wonderful people, including many of our other fellow Octopi members. And Michelle Raz was one of them, who is a specialist in autism. And 2 people in the same week recommended the Octopus Movement to me. And I remember the first call that Perry and I had, when you find your tribe, you just can be yourself. That's how I felt when I met my now husband. Before I was with him, I was with a very neurotypical guy who was wonderful and set me on the path that I'm on now of spiritual, personal development. And when I met my now husband, it was the first time in my life, Grant, where I didn't feel like I had to fake it. Like I could just be my quirky, eccentric, totally off the wall self and be loved and accepted. And so when I learned about the Octopus Movement, of this tribe of people, and first there was Perry, and then I've had the privilege and honor of meeting many of our Octopi members around the world, there's a sense of psychological safety. And Grant, that's what interests me the most about what we're doing with OptiMatch, what the Octopus Movement is doing, is how can we as human beings cultivate greater psychological safety so that we have the freedom to be ourselves and that we don't have to mask. Because so many of us mask. We think we need to speak a certain way, look a certain way. And what if we all had the freedom to just be? That's a dream.
It is a dream, and thank you for bringing up masking. Most our audience is wide, and they may not be familiar with the term. And let's take a stab at that, less so from a technical perspective and more so from what it looked like for you. What did masking look like for you? You gave some examples of trying to fit in with how you speak and how you move. But what did masking look like for you? Because you are spot on in my exploration and growing my network of uh, uh, neurodiverse and uh, folks. Women manifest differently. They present differently. It just moves differently with women. So how did that happen, and how did that work for you from a masking perspective?
Yeah, so to give a context for masking, I'll give like a broad strokes. It's trying to say the right thing or be normal is what I would call it in any normal situation. So when I was very young, I would go to a party or something. I was constantly saying things that were horribly offensive to people, horribly. And it doesn't normally happen now. Now that I've been on this journey for 7 years of understanding how to better self regulate, one of the things I've learned is as long as I've eaten enough, which I have to eat every 3 hours, there's a schedule for it, as long as I've slept enough, as long as I've taken care of my mental, emotional well-being, meditated, I don't normally have to mask. I'm normally more consciously aware, as my friend Arthur would say, of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. However, I'll give you a funny example of a keynote I was giving in LA. So I get into LA, it's late January, there's a conference of people who I love and admire who are in my old industry, and I'm so honored to be invited to speak there. Well, because of the time change, I arrive in LA from Europe. I get up at 3 a.m. that day and my talk is at 8. It goes well, it's really great, it goes amazing. So that's all good. However, fast forward to 6 o'clock that night, I had not eaten enough. I had not slept now for 16 hours, and my ability to mask and whatever you would consider be normal goes out the window. So I'm going to give you a real-time example that is mortifying and yet funny to prove a point. So my friend Jen, who I've known for 15 years in the legal industry, is always impeccably dressed, and she's wearing some spectacular coat, and she's standing next to this big, tall friend of mine, Al, who I also know in the industry. So I go up to Jen. I'm like, oh, girl, what are you wearing? You look fabulous. She's like, oh, it's Alexander McQueen. And Al, standing next to us, tall, big guy, looks crestfallen. And he says, nobody ever compliments me on what I'm wearing. You can't make this up, Grant. Without missing a beat, my inability to mask brain goes right to, well, Al, the flecks of gray in your beard match perfectly with the gray in your sweatshirt. And the look
There you
of
go.
the look of like Al and Jen is like, she didn't really just say that, but most of the time, as long as I've eaten enough, self-regulated, meditated, slept enough, that doesn't normally come out. But sometimes that used to be my whole young adult life, which is why I felt so alone and, afraid of being in social settings because I would be to try and self-soothe so I could try and have some sense of normalcy around people.
Mhm. Well, thank you for that. I've been told that I am less than aware of my comments around other people that I don't know, and I'll
Yeah.
just say what's on my mind. I'm like, well, either they can't hear me or I'm never going to see them again, so I'll just say what's on my mind. So I can commiserate with that. Thank you uh, again, Jennifer, for giving that uh, introspection when it comes to masking and how that came for you. So, with the time that we have left, you started this conversation talking about the schools that you created, you and your father. So, can you walk us through that? How does one go about creating a school, especially in a place that places like you've mentioned, uh, and not one but two? And what are these schools about? Who do they serve? What's the purpose? Tell us more.
Yeah. So when I, again, giving accolades to my ex-husband, who I really owe so much of my life to, he really helped me when I met him. I was in a really dark place. I was bulimic. I was suicidal. I was drugs, alcohol, everything. And then my ex-husband introduced me to kind of spiritual development and personal development. And that was the catalyst that then put me on the path now. Well, one day in about 2010, I was reading a book called Half the Sky. And it's by Nicholas Kristof and his wife, who are Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. And it was about how women hold up half the sky. And as I read that book, I just fell asleep crying every night. My ex-husband saw me and he's like, what's wrong? And I said, well, I don't know what to do. There are so many atrocities in the world. And, my brain couldn't solve the logic puzzle. It was like, I does not compute. This is terrible that these things are happening. And I said, maybe we could donate money to build a school. It was 30,000. He said, my ex-husband then went on to read the book. And he said, why don't we start building schools? So really, he gets the credit for that, of that initial thought bubble of what if we were to build one? So about a year or two later, I was doing relatively well. It was my first company. And I was like, okay, great. I'm going to put aside 35,000, which is how much it costs to build a school. The World Bank matches that. And I'm going to put that aside to go build a school. And a friend of mine had built a school in Cambodia. So my ex-husband and I go off to Cambodia, and we really wanted to go collaborate with this person who he had built a school with. But something didn't feel right. My intuition, my spidey sense, I didn't trust that all 35K of that money was going to go to the kids, and I didn't know how to do that. So again, the logic puzzle came up and my brain couldn't reconcile or solve it. So we bought supplies for the kids in Cambodia, but I didn't wind up giving them the 35K. A few more years goes by. I'm part of a thought leader group. We're meeting in Monterey, California. And there's about 100 of us in a room, and you're partnered with somebody else, and you look each other in the eye and you say, what matters to you? And this was around 2017. And this is about 5 years later. This young kid says, what matters to you? And I said, building schools. He said, great. Are you doing it? I said, no. And he said, why not? I said, I gave up on it. I'd talked to people much about it over the years, but, you need infrastructure and relationships with the ministries of education. I had no idea how to reconcile all this. So he says, I want you to stand up in this room and share that as soon as we get to the break. So I stand up. And this woman named Linda Burgess stands up and she says, call Skylar on Monday at Build On. So buildon.org is who I wound up partnering with. And they're an extraordinary organization that builds in Malawi, in Senegal, in Nepal, in parts of Central America and other parts of the world. And I was just very lucky that voila, there I was. And next thing you know, they have all the relationships with the ministries of education, because as the authors of Half the Sky found out, it's not just number one about building the school. It's number two, getting the villagers buy-in to build the schools. And number three, getting them to send their children, both male and female, to school in equal amounts and getting time away from farming, which takes away from the villagers. So may I close with one story, Grant, that I learned from the founder of Build On that really changed my life?
Yes, please do.
So I believe it's Jim who's the founder of it. So I go to build my first school, and it's a few months before that, and I'm doing a fireside chat with this guy, Jim, from Build On. And Jim shares a story of the first school he had ever built 25 years ago in Nepal. And so it's now 25 years later, and he's here at the location of the inaugural school that, to answer your earlier question, solves primary and middle school children. So he's there, he's giving this speech, and there's a man who's kind of crunched up just outside of the entrance to where he's giving the speech. And Jim's trying to motion him in, and the guy is shaking his head. And at the end of the speech, Jim gets up and he walks over to where this man is kind of crouched on the ground. And he says, excuse me, sir, were you a part of building this first school? And the man very humbly nods his head. And he says, oh, well, thank you so much. You want to tell me about it? How often were you here on site? Tell me a little bit about it. And so the man starts to share with him that he could only be there, Grant, once every 11 days to help build. And Jim says, well, why only once every 11 days? And he said, because I was a slave and I only got 1 day off every 11 days. And he said, well, sir, why would you spend that 1 day off? And he said, because I have 4 children, the youngest of whom had polio. And I knew if I didn't help build the school and he didn't go to school, he would die in our village. And that young man, his youngest son, went on to not only matriculate through that school, but to sneak his way into Kathmandu University and to become the head of a bank. And that kid would not have survived otherwise.
Wow. Well, that speaks to many things, but the power of tenacity, education, dedication, commitment, passion, all of those things, and all of these things I see in you. So thank you for sharing that story. Thank you for sharing your story. Very appreciative of you being here, especially with the loss of not just a family member, but your father, who you had a close relationship with. Thank you for walking us through your origin story, telling us about the schools that you've been able to build, and being open, honest, transparent, and vulnerable with your past history. Because you could not be with us, but you are, which is great, which is very exciting because you're doing lots of excellent things. And speaking of those things, where can folks get in contact with you? What's your contact info?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can go to Jennifer, K as in kite, Hill, HILL.com is my personal website where people can book me for speaking, or I only take a handful of coaching clients at one point, but I do have one slot open for a coaching client. And then aside from that, if people are interested in what we're doing on the OptiMatch side, very easy, om.app. So om.app, and would love to hop on a call with anybody. There's a contact page on there as well if you'd like to connect further.
Awesome. Well, that concludes another episode of the Octopus Movement podcast. We've been speaking with Jennifer Hill. Excellent conversation. I'd like to remind you, all of our listeners, that there is potential in each and every one of you. I encourage you to embrace your unique ways of thinking, and join the movement. If you'd like to learn more, you can find us at the octopusmovement.org. Until then, I'm signing off. This is Grant Harris. Until next time, keep thinking. Thank you very much.